Good evening.
Hello.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to give another 2 minutes and see who else shows up. Then we can get started.
That makes a lot of sense.
Oh, I can't see anything. Yep.
But one of reading glasses and one of driving glasses?
No, they're both progressives, but those are my regular glasses that I can see everything with. These are my computer glasses, which have a much bigger section for the medium distance.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, I can see with the other ones if I tilt my head just right, but it's easier this way.
Mm-hmm. Remind me what jalapeno means.
Well, it's this symbolic, not quite transfer in which we cement a deal of some kind by my handing you something that you don't get to keep and you have to give it back. So you can transfer ownership of things that way, not the object you're actually passing, but something else. Or you can just agree to a commitment. Okay. Let's get started because it's 8:01. This is part 7 in our continuing series on the 4th chapter of Bava Metzia. And we are going to be at the bottom of page 47a, the top of page 47b. And we're starting by referring back to a statement that we made last time, which I apologize was a couple of weeks ago, but so I'll remind us of what it said. We had a case in which somebody seems to be offering an undefined amount of money for something that's for sale and says, will you sell it to me for this? And so rattles some coins in their hand, but doesn't actually say how much they are. And the other person says yes. And the statement last time we had this was, well, we had a dispute about it, but the position that we're interested in tonight said that the seller, after they get the money and they count it, can complain that it wasn't enough money. They have a complaint of ona'ah. Ona'ah is where you complain that somebody paid you less than 5/6 of what something was worth, or they charged you more than 7/6, right? The price was off by more than 1/6 and you got cheated, and you can get the transaction fixed or reversed based on that complaint. So it seems that the transaction works even though you don't know how much you're getting paid. And even though you agreed to it, you can still complain if it wasn't the right amount of money. Which you could see how somebody might say, well, you agreed to it, but apparently we don't. Okay. In any case, we're interested now, not so much in the price as in what the method of purchase was, because the original statement said this works because it's like chalipin. And so now we're going to try to figure out in what way is it like chalipin, and what can that tell us about how chalipin works. Just to review, chalipin is this kinyan, it's this method of acquisition, right? You can acquire stuff, or you could acquire responsibilities, either one, by one person handing another an object. And it seems like the object itself doesn't actually change ownership. You give it back afterwards, but the handing of the object is an action like like a handshake or something that makes things real. And this is based on a pasuk in the 4th chapter of Megillat Rut, which we will get to again later this evening, in which during the scene where Boaz is confronting the other person who might want to marry Ruth and clarifying that he's not planning to. And in that scene, it says, and this is the way it used to work in Israel, that one man would take off his shoe and hand it to the other person in order to establish anything or to do a sale. And what each of those parts of that verse means is going to be important later. We'll get to that. All right, let's get started here. So, Amar Mar, which means literally the master said, but the way that it's used, it means you, the teacher that I'm talking to, you said this thing, and I'm asking you a question about this thing that you said earlier in the class. Mechorli be'elu kana v'yesh lo alav ona. So if somebody said, sell it to me for these, then and then presumably handed over the handful of coins, he has purchased and he has a claim of ona'ah, which, as I said, means he could complain that it's the wrong amount of money. So let's say that the fact that Rav Huna said this case means that he thinks you can use coins for chalipin. Because, as I said, the original statement said that the transaction works even though you don't count the money because it is similar to chalipin. So if handing somebody coins is similar to chalipin, maybe we can make a little leap and say that it would work for chalipin also. Well, we reject that. Lo, Rav Huna savar la ka Rabbi Yochanan. No, Rav Huna, just in this particular case, he thinks this case works because he holds like Rabbi Yochanan, and this is a position of Rabbi Yochanan that we've seen before, at least once, maybe twice, where we have had the whole chapter a sort of continuing dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and his chavruta Reish Lakish about what the original state was of how purchases worked. Right? Is it originally the case that a transaction was finished as soon as the money was handed over, and then the rabbis changed things so that now the transaction isn't finished until the merchandise is delivered? Or were things always to begin with that the way they are at the end, that the transaction isn't complete until the merchandise is delivered? Okay, and Rabbi Yochanan is the first of the two positions I said. The Amar, Rabbi Yochanan said, Dvar Torah ma'ut konot. According to the Torah, money acquires, meaning if I pay you, then now the thing is mine, even though I don't have it yet. Umipnei ma amru mishicha kona. And why did they say that pulling acquires? Meaning, why did they say that what makes the transaction complete is the purchaser getting the merchandise that they're buying? It is a decree made to protect buyers, because otherwise the seller might say to the buyer, your wheat burned in my attic. Meaning, I'm sorry, there was a fire, your stuff doesn't exist anymore. So in order to prevent that kind of problem, we're going to make it so that the person who has the ability to rescue things from fires is also the person who owns it. That is to say, we're going to say it doesn't belong to you until you actually have physical custody of it. Okay. Milta deshchicha gazrubu rabbanan. And continuing, that was it for Rabbi Yochanan's position, but continuing to try to understand Rav Huna's interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Huna would say that the rabbis only made their decrees about cases that are normal, cases that are common. And in any case that's sufficiently strange isn't going to be covered by this rabbinic decree. And so our case, in which you have somebody who agrees to buy something and somebody else who agrees to sell something without either of them knowing how much the money is, you just, take a handful of coins and agree that that will be the right price. That's a sufficiently odd way to purchase an object that it doesn't fall under the rabbinic decree, And so handing over the money would complete the transaction because it would just revert to the original rules. And that's why Rav Huna thinks that it works, not because he thinks it's really chalipin, but because he thinks that it's just an unusually old-fashioned transaction in which transferring the money makes it work. Okay. So now we have a person who is confusingly called Mar Huna, who, as far as I know, is a person unrelated to the Rav Huna we were dealing with a second ago. Amrle Mar Huna breder of Nachman Rav Ashi. So this guy named Mar Huna, the son of Rav Nachman, said to Rav Ashi, Atun hachi matnitula, anan hachi matnitinla. He said, well, you guys over there in wherever Rav Ashi is, you teach this teaching of Rav Huna, as you know, if we examine it, we could figure out that he follows Rabbi Yochanan, and so he doesn't really think you can do chalipin with coins. But we have another different version of the teaching, and in our version, we have v'chein amar Rav Huna ein matbea naseh chalipin. Right? Our version of the story about this case with the uncounted amount of money ends by saying, and Rav Huna also says money that you can't use coins for chalipin. So it would seem that in the world of Mar Huna, the son of Rav Nachman, there was never a question to begin with, because they just knew that was the way it works, and that's how they recited it, which seems like a confirmation that what we have figured out is probably correct. Okay, now we are going to get to what we should have had if we were organizing things in a more modern sort of way. This would probably have been the beginning of our discussion of chalipin. Instead of coming in from the side with, well, can you use coins or can you not use coins? How about we start at the beginning with, well, what are we talking about? And so now we're going to go back and have that conversation. Okay, so b'meh konin. So with how does one do the kinyan of chalipin, and in particular, with what kind of object do you do chalipin? Rav Amar b'kelav shel koneh. Rav says you use a vessel that belongs to the purchaser, and by vessel here we mean not necessarily a container, but any small, useful man-made object. As we will see later, it doesn't have to be an especially valuable object; it just has to be usable. And examples that we routinely use now would be things like a pen or a handkerchief, or we're looking for something that's small enough to fit in your hand and is man-made and useful and not food, as we will see in a minute. Most people think that doesn't work. Okay, so Rob says that this object needs to belong to the buyer. Because the buyer is the one who really wants this transaction to happen, right? They really want the seller to take the thing from them, so they should use their own object in order to make that happen. And the reason why they want the seller to take the thing from them is because they really want to buy the object. We're assuming here that buyers are more enthusiastic about buying and selling than sellers are, which is something that Gemara assumes frequently, that people don't really want to sell their stuff. People would really rather keep whatever they currently have. And you sell things because you need money because you're stuck, but you buy things because you want them. And so we assume the buyer is the more enthusiastic party. The Levi Amar, and Levi said, Bekelev shel makneh, kedibainan lememar lekaman. And Levi said it has to be the vessel of the seller And then the Gemara says something sort of self-aware here in a way that's not so normal for the Gemara, as we'll explain below. Like, we're going to explain Levi's position, but not yet. So be patient. Amar le Rav Huna midiskarta, sorry, Lerava. So Rav Huna from Diskarta, that's our third person this evening, if you're keeping track, named Huna. As far as I know, they're all unrelated to each other. So this is Rav Huna from Diskarta. He said to Rava, Ula Levi de Amar Bekelev Shel Makna. So according to Levi, who said that it has to be a vessel belonging to the seller, I don't understand why he's saying that, because Haka Kani Ara Agav Glima. Because in that case, he's selling him land, right? The reason why you would use a kinyan chalipin most of the time is because you're transferring ownership of something you can't actually pick up. So a lot of the time, this is used to buy and sell real estate. So we're just assuming that's the standard case here. He's selling him land on top of or on the back of a piece of clothing. So we need to take a moment to the side here. There is a kind of acquisition known as agav, which I guess means on the back of, but we're just going to call it agav because everyone else does, in which you buy movable objects by associating them with a piece of real estate. They don't need to be touching the real estate. They don't need to be on top of the real estate. They don't need to be in the same county as the real estate. You just need to make a deal with somebody that you're selling them both your house and, I don't know, a t-shirt. And then, even though you couldn't normally acquire a t-shirt unless the t-shirt was present, right? Remember, our principle all the way through has been that you can't close a transaction on movable objects unless you deliver them. We have been saying that all the way through. An exception to that, there are exceptions, and one of them would be that if you associate it with real estate, then as soon as you've transferred the ownership of the real estate, which of course you don't need to deliver because you can't actually move real estate, that's kind of part of the point of it. As soon as you have transferred the ownership of the real estate, the ownership of the t-shirt in our case, or the movable property, whatever it is, will transfer at the same time. And that's called agav, on top of. So not physically on top of, but because of the transfer of ownership of the real estate, you've also transferred the ownership of the movable property. And we have a principle many times in many places, although I don't think we've come across it together before, but we will see it again in the future. We have a principle that says that you can transfer the ownership of movable things, agav real estate, but you cannot transfer real estate, agav movable objects. Okay, and Rav Huna from Diskarta here is saying it sounds like Levi's understanding of the way that Chalipin works is that it violates this principle, because the sellers, suppose I'm selling you my house, and in order to finalize the sale of my house, I hand you a handkerchief. It sounds like I'm selling you the handkerchief and you're acquiring the house with it, which would be exactly what doesn't work. You could do it the other way around. I can sell a house so you can get a handkerchief with it, but I can't do it that way. Okay, so he says, I don't understand how what Levi means. It sounds like it violates this rule. And imkain havule nechasim sheyesh lahen achrayut v'niknim im nechasim she'en lahem achrayut. In that case, that would mean that you had property that is responsible property, which is to say real estate, a property that can have a responsibility here means in the sense of a mortgage or a lien, right? It could be responsible to pay a debt. So property that can be liened is being purchased agav, on top of or with, property that can't be liened, which is just other language for saying real estate is being sold with non-real estate. And we have the opposite in a Mishnah. Nechasim she'ein lahem achrayut niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut. Right, the Mishnah, the Mishnah says, I just saw this quoted in a Gemara in Baba Kama, but I would guess the Mishnah itself is probably originally from Baba Batra, but I didn't look it up. The Mishnah says that responsible property, that is real estate, can be purchased with, cannot be purchased with movable property, with non-responsible property. Okay, so, but remember that Rav Huna from Diskarta was saying this is a challenge to Rava about Levi. Rava responds to him, Amar le, ihava Levi hafa. If Levi were here, and I think that the Rava is a couple of generations after Levi. I don't think Levi's alive anymore at this point. But if Levi were here, hava mapik la'apach pulse denura. He would take fiery discs out of the fire in front of you. Now, this seems to have been something, a part of an extremely unpleasant corporal punishment in which you beat people with discs of metal that you had been heating in the fire. Sounds brutal and horrible to me, but I don't think Rava is actually threatening Rav Huna from Diskarta with this punishment. I think he's just speaking with a touch of exaggeration here, but there's definitely a touch of a threat here, right? Like you're being totally outrageous and you're accusing Levi of saying something really stupid when it's obvious that you're the one who doesn't understand what's going on. By the way, I do not endorse as a pedagogic technique threatening or mocking students or calling them dumb, in case anyone was wondering. It's not a good idea. It doesn't work. And it's mean anyway, even if it did work. All right, but Rav is still talking. He says, Mi savart glima maknele. Do you really think that when the owner, when the seller of the real estate hands his cloak to the buyer of the real estate in order to sell him the land or house or whatever it is he's selling him, you really think that he means for the ownership of the cloak to change? And that's a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously no. The seller is supposed to get his cloak back at the end of this transaction. With the benefit that the seller gets by having the buyer be willing to take the cloak from his hand, which seems like a pretty limited benefit. Excuse me, could you hold my cloak, please? Sure, I'll hold your cloak. Right? That's a pretty small and limited benefit that you get from the person in that moment. But in return for that benefit, he is consenting to sell him the land. Right? It's the, I think what his point is that it's the holding of the object that matters. He's not actually giving him the object. He's just enjoying watching the other person hold it for a moment. Ketanai, and this is like a dispute that we have in a Braita, which is this Braita is going to try to interpret the verse in Megillat Rut that this whole mess starts from. And Rava thinks that the dispute between Levi and Rav about whose stuff it is that you were using for Chalipin, it derives originally from this Braita. So here we have our pasuk. Let's have, maybe we don't really need context. We'll just read the pasuk. They gave us the whole pasuk. V'zo lefanim b'Yisrael. This is what used to happen in Israel, right? So when from the perspective of the narrator of the book of Rut, this behavior requires explanation because it seems not to be normal in the context of the person who's writing the book. That's itself a little bit curious. I don't know really where to go with that, but it does seem curious to me. So this is what used to happen in Israel, al ha-ge'ula ve'al ha-timura, for redemption and for exchange. Redemption, presumably, is referring to redemption of fields, which in the context that we're in Megillat Rut, what's happening is that Naomi is selling the land that Machlon used to own, right? If you want to be strictly rabbinic about this, Naomi shouldn't be heir to either her husband or her sons. It must be that her husband and or her sons died owing her money, right? And she's seized this land in payment of her money, and now she's selling the land in order to get the money they owe her, because according to the laws of inheritance, the truth is that the land ought to automatically already belong to the nearest male relative in the male line, which is to say the guy that Boaz is talking to, Ploni Almoni. He seems to be the nearest male relative. So we shouldn't be offering him to buy the land. He should already own it. So it must be that Naomi was owed money and she seized the land and now she's selling it to raise that money. And now they have a choice. Either the people inside the family can buy the land, in which case the land will stay in the family, or they can actually let it go on the open market, in which case they might end up with weird strangers that they don't like farming the land right next to them. And so the family has, and from the Torah's perspective, not just a right, but also a responsibility to try to come up with the money to keep the land in the family. And that act of buying the land to keep it in the family is called redemption. Okay, so that's the redemption we're talking about here. So a redemption and on exchange, which we'll address in a second what that might be. And l'kayem kol davar, to establish anything. Shalaf ish na'alo, a man slips off his shoe, v'natan l're'ehu, and gives it to his friend. Now, you'll notice that, unfortunately, in this pasuk, it does not say which man takes off his shoe, or which person gives it to the other person. I think we are assuming that the person taking off the shoe is also the person giving it, although I think hypothetically you could build in an ambiguity there too, in which one person was taking off somebody else's shoe. But I don't think we're going to try that. But you could go here either with the buyer takes off his shoe and hands it to the seller, or the seller takes off his shoe and hands it to the buyer. Either one, I think, works equally well in the original story and in this verse. Okay, but the Braita is not even at that level of interpretation yet. It says Geula zo mechira, redemption, that's sale, and now they feel the need to prove that. V'chein hu omer lo yigael, and that's why it says in these 4 verses that I cited here in Vayikra, it is not redeemed. Right, that's the passage at the very end of Vayikra. The very last thing in Vayikra is a chapter about how to redeem land that your relative has sold. And so we are referencing there, as I said, this kind of purchase of land where you're trying to keep the land in the family, which we call redemption. And so they're quoting the verse in Vayikra just to prove that that's what the word means. Tmurazo chalipin, exchange means chalipin. V'chein hu omer lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiroto. And for this, we have a different verse in Vayikra, which might benefit from the whole verse. So give me 1 second. 27:10. Yeah. So actually, the verse before says, if you had an animal that you're going to offer as a sacrifice, anything that you give to God will be holy. You can't switch it and you can't exchange it. But the word for switch here is chalaf, chet lamed pei, which is the same root as the root of chalipin. Tov b'ra or ra b'tov, either switching good for bad or switching bad for good. Either way, you can't do it. And if you do, in fact, exchange one animal for another, then both the original animal and the animal you exchanged it for will end up being holy. They both have to be offered as sacrifices. Right, so the reason we're quoting this verse is because it has the root memvav resh, meaning to exchange, associated with the root chet lamed pei, meaning to switch, which is the root of our chalipin here. And so they're just demonstrating that those two roots mean the same thing. So they're saying that smura is the old biblical word for what we now call chalipin. L'kayem kol davar shalaf ishna alov natan l're'ehu. Now we're quoting the next bit of the verse, which we quoted already. We're just saying it again before we interpret it. Right, to establish anything, a man slips off his shoe and gives to his friend. Mi natan l'mi, who gives it to who, or who gave it to who in the original story? Boaz natan l'goel. Boaz gave his shoe to the other redeemer. Now, even in this context, it's a little bit hard to know who's the buyer and who's the seller, because what they're transferring is actually the right to buy the field. But I guess Boaz is the one acquiring the right to buy the field, so we'll call him the buyer. So according to this first position, Boaz gives his shoe to the other guy, who we don't have a name for him, so we're just calling him the redeemer. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Goel natan la Boaz. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's the other way around. The Goel gave it to Boaz. So we seem to have here a dispute about whether in the original case that we're deriving everything we know about Chalipin from, whether the buyer gave his shoe to the seller or the seller gave his shoe to the buyer. And we're assuming that that's the original dispute from which our dispute between Rav and Levi descends. Okay. And we have another related bright. Tana. Konin bikli afal pisha in bo shava pruta. The writer says you can acquire something with a kli, with a vessel, even though it's not worth a pruta. So normally, in order to acquire something with money, the money would have to be valuable enough that we would call it money. And the standard for that is they would have to be worth a pruta. But apparently, if you have an object which is considered a vessel, it doesn't need to be worth a pruta. So the standard example of a vessel that's not worth a pruta is like a stick pin. Right? It's a man-made object. You made it on purpose to do something useful. It is in fact useful for its intended purpose. It is not worth anything by itself. You'd have to have a whole bunch of them, and then you could sell them for a small coin. I'm in our culture, maybe it would be a paperclip, right? Although the stick pin would probably still work, actually. Or a needle is the other example that gets used. Although I'm not actually sure in their technology that a pin and a needle are different objects. I don't know enough about the way they do sewing. Okay. So the Amar of Nach, that's all the Breita says. The Breita says that a vessel would work even if it's not worth a pruta. But Amar of Nachman, Rav Nachman says about that statement, Lo shanu ela bekli aval beperi lo. Rav Nachman says they only taught this thing about a kli, but not with fruit. Now, that seems to open itself up to two possible interpretations. One is that they only said this thing about it not needing to be worth money, about a vessel, but not about fruit. So you could do it with fruit, but only if the fruit was worth money. That seems not to be the interpretation the Gemara is going with. So we're going to go with the other one, which is that Rav Nachman says that you can't actually use fruit to do kinyan chalipin at all. It has to be something that could be described as a vessel. But Rav Cheses says, I feel a bit parrot. He says, no, you can even use fruit. My Talmud Rav Nachman. So what's Rav Nachman's reason for saying that it's only a kli and it can't be fruit? Amar kra na'alo. Well, because the text of Megillat Rut said he takes off his shoe. And we're going to need something that's similar to a shoe. Na'al'in midiachrini lo. So the shoes work, other things don't work. Now, we don't seem to be, even in our narrowest reading, we don't seem to be restricting it to actual shoes. We just seem to be restricting it to things that are like shoes. But apparently vessels are enough like shoes, even if they're not actually shoes, but food is not enough like a shoe. My Talmud Rav Sheshet, and what's Rav Sheshet's reason? Rav Sheshet would tell you if you were here, Amar Kra l'kayem kol davar, because the text said that this form of exchange works to establish anything. And he apparently thinks anything is describing the object you use to do the chalipin, not the transaction that you're accomplishing with it. But now we're going to do what we often do when we have difference of interpretation. We're going to ask, well, okay, what does the other side do with each of the proof texts? Because everybody has to account for all of the words. And they have to be able to continue to believe what they believe while accounting for all of the words. The Rav Nachman Nami Ktiv l'kayem kol davar, because Rav Nachman also has the words to establish anything in his verse. So what does he think they mean? He says, "Ahu l'kayem kol davar de niknim b'minal." Rav Nachman thinks, as I said a moment ago, that to establish anything, that means anything can be acquired or transferred with a shoe. Meaning, he thinks the anything is about the thing you're purchasing. You can purchase anything using chalipin, not that it's about the object you're using for the chalipin. So it may turn out on the other side that Rav Nachman has a broader conception of the uses you can put chalipin to than Rav Sheshet does. We're not going to get to that tonight, but perhaps we'll get to it at a different time. Rav Sheshet nami ktiv na'alo, and Rav Sheshet, on the other hand, also has the word shoe. So what's he going to do with it if he's not saying it has to be something that's like a shoe? Amar lecha Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet would say to you, if you were here, Ma na'alo davar misuyam, af kol davar misuyam. So Rav Sheshet would say, just like a shoe is a specific thing, it's a whole object. So you have to use something which is a whole object. You can't use part of an object. But he's not requiring it to be any particular kind of object. So what is he excluding by saying it has to be a whole thing? Because he's saying that if you had half of a piece of fruit, half a pomegranate, or you had half a nut, that would not work. It sounds like if I have a whole nut, that would work even if the nut is not especially valuable, even if it's very small, whatever. Maybe I have, I don't know, one pumpkin seed or something. That maybe that would be, since it's a whole object, maybe that would be good enough, even though it's probably not worth a pruta. Okay. In our continuing theme of having consecutive people who have the same name but are not the same person, we have another Rav Sheshet who's not the same as the Rav Sheshet we had a minute ago. So Amar Rav Sheshet Breder Rav Idi, Rav Sheshet, the son of Rav Idi, said, Keman katvinan ha'idna b'mana dekasher lemiknayabe. So Rav Sheshet, the son of Rav Idi, said, we write in our documents at the end of the description of the transaction that the document is attesting to, we write that the transaction that the document attests to happened with a vessel that is kosher to transfer ownership with, a mana de kasher lemiknayabe. Right? That phrase should be familiar if you've ever read a ketubah. Our ketubahs still end with this phrase. It was transacted in front of us with a vessel that is kosher to transfer ownership with. So Rav Sheshet bar Idi, the son of Rav Idi, says when we write that at the end of our documents, can we demonstrate from the fact that we write it who we follow in this dispute? So he says, Bimana la fuke mid Rav Sheshet, the Amar Konim B'Pero. So it says with a vessel that's kosher. So that sounds like it excludes Rav Sheshet because Rav Sheshet doesn't require it to be a vessel. Rav Sheshet would have been perfectly happy with a pomegranate. So it sounds like we rule against Rav Sheshet. De kasher, that is kosher, that's la fuke mida Shmuel, the Amar Konin bin Maroka. That seems to be excluding Shmuel, who we have not quoted here in this discussion, but he often goes with Rav and Levi, but we did not quote him up above when we quoted them. And he said you can't use a vessel that is Maroka. There is a dispute between Rashi and Tosfot about what Maroka is, which I cited in the footnote. Rashi says Maroka is a vessel which is made out of cow manure. And Tosfot says that Maroka is date pits that are used for processing parchment. Either way, it's some sort of thing which is sort of, but not quite a vessel. Either because, if you're following Rashi, because it's gross, so we're not going to dignify it with that name, or if you're following Tosfot, because it's we actually do have a use for it, but it's not really processed much past its original natural state. So we're not ready to call it a vessel. It's really just a date pit. Either way, Shmuel says that we don't use it. And we seem to be Shmuel says we do use a Maroka. I apologize. And the wording that we used, a vessel which is kosher, seems to imply to the Gemara that there are, in fact, according to this wording, there are vessels that you can't acquire things with, that we're being like picky among our vessels. And it seems like whatever this thing is that Shmuel's letting you use, it's like the very first thing you would say we're not using if you were going to be picky. So if we're being picky, we're definitely not following him. Okay. Lemiknaya, the fact that our documents say to transfer ownership with, that's la fuke midalevi, the Amar Bekelev Shel Makne. That means we can't possibly be ruling according to Levi, who says that we use the vessels of the seller, because Kamash Malan l'miknaya v'lo l'knuye, because it says we say to transfer ownership, we don't say to buy. So it must be that we're the person taking the vessel should be giving away his stuff by taking the vessel rather than acquiring stuff. They think that's the implication of transfer ownership rather than buy. And therefore we're rejecting Levi, or we're asserting that our standard document language rejects Levi, which presumably leaves us following Rav. Bay, right? It can transfer ownership with it. With it, Rav Papa Amar l'meute matbea. Rav Papa says means that you can't use a coin. Exactly why is not completely clear to me. Rav Zvid v'itema Rav Ashi Amar l'meute isurei hana'a. Rav Zvid and Rav Ashi, or Rav Zvid or Rav Ashi, it's one or the other. We don't know which one it was. Right? The tradition got corrupted, and we're not sure which person it is. One of them said that the words with it tells us that it has to be something that you're allowed to use, right? So there are certain things in halacha that are not allowed to be used for anything. Say, for example, something which has been worshipped as an idol. It's forbidden to get any benefit from it. So if we say you can do something with it, that sounds like it's something you're allowed to do things with. So it can't be an object you're not allowed to use. Ikad Amri, or alternatively, that very end bit might have a different version. Be'amar Rav Papa l'mu'ute matbea. With it, Rav Papa says that excludes a coin. That's the same actually as our last version. De kasher, which is kosher, Amar Rav Zvid v'Item Rav Ashi Limute Yisurei Hana. That's what Rav Zvid or Rav Ashi, whoever it is, says is excluding things which you're not allowed to use. And now that actually makes a certain amount of sense. If you say this thing is kosher for use, presumably that means it isn't an object you're not allowed to use. That should be, in fact, what kosher for use means. But that leaves Rav Zvid and maybe Rav Ashi without a way of rejecting Shmuel up above, who said, when Shmuel said you can use miroka, which was either the utensils made out of cow manure or the date pits, whichever that was, we rejected Shmuel because it said it had to be a vessel that was kosher. And we said that if we're going to be picky about what kind of vessels we're using, then we're definitely going to reject the ones made out of cow manure or the ones that are not really changed from being their original date pits. So this will leave Rav Zvid and Rav Ashi without a way of rejecting Shmuel because they are now using that word for something else. And in that case, we're going to have to say for them about Morika lo itzri. It doesn't, they would say they would be comfortable using the word kosher to exclude things that you're not allowed to use because they think that you don't even really need to exclude Shmuel. Shmuel is so obviously ridiculous that we would never have accepted him to begin with. And we don't need words to exclude him. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Are there questions?
So what's left that you can use?
Okay. So in the end, it seems like we are ruling like Rav, which is to say that you have to use a kli, a utensil or a vessel. That is, as I said, a man-made small object that is useful, which is broad, but doesn't include everything. For example, as I said, it doesn't include food or things that are so gross no one would use them for anything, or things that you're not allowed to use for anything. And that it has to be a utensil that belongs to the buyer. We seem just across the board to be accepting Rav and rejecting everybody else, which is not a terribly big surprise. We often follow Rav. Anyone else? Okay. I will see you guys next Monday night. Have a wonderful week.